Okay, so now that we've looked at the case study of the Americas, we're going to move on to a case study of the British Empire. But before we do that, I just want to mention something that I actually forgot to mention in the case study of the Americas. Is we looked at how indentured laborers were reattached and then dispossessed of their access to the means of production and subsistence. But the one I didn't give an example of was these kind of unwaged backcountry farmers. Now, we talked a little bit about them in the American Revolution, right? And mostly what they just wanted was to be left alone. They wanted, like, most of what they were resisting was market penetration. So just another example of how a group of people who were reattached to the means of subsistence by owning or at least squatting on land that they basically made theirs, they were not producing for a market. These were very small farmers who were essentially living a subsistence lifestyle. Maybe they would have sold their crop in some local markets, but for the most part, they just want to be left alone, right? You see that a lot in the United States today. People that just want to be left alone, right? And the way that that kind of primitive accumulation or accumulation by dispossession would have played itself out for them would be once commercial agriculture penetrates the areas in which they live and occupy their land, is they're basically forced to adapt to the market or not. And most of these people didn't want to. They just wanted to be left alone. They didn't want to be connected or integrated into a larger market society. So often what happened is they were driven out. Partly they could be driven out because, when commercial agricultural moves in, they can't compete. And many of these people, had debts on their land. And as a result of not being able to compete, would lose their land and then become dispossessed of that land. So that's just an example how these upcountry farmers, right, were really resisting the penetration and the expansion of the market into their areas. And once that happened, a lot of them lost their land and were essentially driven off of it because prices rose and they couldn't keep up with their debts, and eventually that land would have been consolidated by much more commercially minded farmers. And now these people are now living as wage laborers, just like what happened to their great-grandparents in England in the 16th century. Okay, so what we're going to do now, just that I got that corrective out of the way, is look at the case study of the British Empire. Okay, so we looked at the American colonies, we're going to look at the British Empire. Now, this was not included in part of your readings for today, although some of you may be familiar with this already. So what we're going to look at here is essentially the coolie trade. Now, the word coolie itself is a derogatory term that was devised by the British as a way of insulting people. It is still a derogatory term. It's a word I'm not going to use very often in the course of this lecture because it can be a very offensive term, but I just wanted to introduce the idea of it at this point. Now, what this trade was the British Empire dealing with the abolition of slavery. It was supposed to be a kind of transitory system from slavery to eventually what would be free wage labor. So to understand how this trade gets set up, how indentured labor from South Asia and Southern China ends up as part of this persistence of unfree labor in the British Empire, you have to understand what happens with slavery. So just to give you a little bit of background at this point, we'll look at a man named, here he is, Olida Equiano. Now, Equiano was a slave himself who basically was freed, and he worked in the Royal Navy for a number of years. He was almost re-enslaved in Georgia when he was a free person, but luckily was able to resist it. And the key thing, and what was remarkable about Olida Equiano, was obviously most slaves were not taught to read and write. He was, and he wrote quite well. In fact, he wrote the first-hand account of what living as a slave was like. And it was published in 1789 in London. And the publication of his book basically jump-started the abolitionist movement in Great Britain and the United States. The abolitionist movement and people who referred to themselves or identified or called themselves abolitionists were people who refer and supported the abolition of slavery. There were abolitionists in the American Revolution, partly because many people thought slavery was going to die out. And as I said in the last lecture, they don't anticipate the rise of cotton in the 1820s, which kind of reinvigorates slavery in the United States. But in England, the public was turning against the very notion of slavery itself. And Olida Equiano, when he published in 1789, it really changed everything in terms of the way people understood slavery, because the British public could read about what his experiences were like, and he recounted horrible awful experiences of what the system of slavery was like. Slave owners in Britain could no longer pretend that it was somehow, I mean, it's a ridiculous argument, but it was somehow beneficial for slaves. That it was just a horrible, horrible system, and this was the first town to count. I think he was even called to testify in Parliament at one point. So the abolitionist movement gets going in England in the late 18th century. Equiano dies, I think, in 1797 at that point. But by 1806, I believe it is, if I just check here, 1807, the slave trade was actually banned in the British Empire. And by 1833, slavery itself is abolished in the British Empire. So the question becomes, right? You've got these plantation economies in the Caribbean. You've also got plantation economies not just in the Caribbean, but also in the Indian Ocean. British Mauritius, you've got Fiji in the Pacific, right? The British Empire at this point has expanded well beyond its sort of North American stronghold, especially after it loses the American colonies. The British kind of reinvigorate their expansion in the Indian subcontinent and in Asia Pacific. And one of the things that they do, and also in parts of Africa as well. And one of the things they do is they have to think about, well, how are we actually going to replace slavery? If you have an entire system of staple crop production that relied on the forced kidnapping and coercion violently of an entire group of people, when that system is no longer legal and no longer something that is available to you, well, what do you do after that? Well, some people thought, well, they could pay former slaves a wage, although you have to remember, this is the early 19th century, the kind of incredibly racist notions people had about the ability of Africans to work, if not coerced, was exactly what you think it is. People in England, or particularly ex-slave owners and plantation owners, thought that the only way people of African descent could be made to work is through violent coercion. Of course, it's ridiculous, but that's what they believed. So the question became, well, how do we and who works these plantations if slavery is no longer available? The other problem was, imagine yourself, if you were an ex-slave and you were now given your freedom, would you want to still be doing the same job? Would you want to still be working for the guy that used to legally own you? No, you wouldn't. You'd probably leave. You'd want your own land, just like anybody, right? So a lot of what they interpreted as idleness or laziness was just slaves who said, you know, I've been doing this my entire life. My grandfather did this. My father did this. I ain't working for you anymore. I'm going to go and pursue my own interests. I'm going to try to acquire my own land, or at the very least sell my labor to someone else. I'm not working for you anymore. And so they had a hard time redisciplining these people who were now free. So one of the things they do is they turn to the colonies of India and as well as, which of course China is independent at that time, of southern China. And the British Empire is really the leaders in this, although it happens all over. And the first example we'll look at is the Chinese. So Britain basically, through labor agents, and sometimes it was not free, and sometimes it was people who signed contracts for when I say freely signed contracts, in that they signed a contract, but in many ways they were tricked. So what happens is the British go in, and also a lot of American merchants traded in indentured servants from China especially. And what they did was they go to China and they bring in a bunch of indentured servants who, in its most benign sense, but it's not benign, freely sign a contract. And they are sent to British Mauritius, to Fiji, and also the British Caribbean, so places like Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, British Jamaica, but not just the British Caribbean, also to the Spanish Caribbean. Some Chinese indentured servants ended up in Cuba or Peru and parts of the South Pacific, right? And it works very similar to how the indentured labor system worked in North America, only the difference is this is racialized. And the conditions are much more harsh as a result of that. And also, this idea, this happened a little bit in the American colonies, but less so. Obviously, if you're on an island as small as Trinidad, there's a lot less places to run away to than if you're in North America, the sort of vast continent of North America. So what happens is, it's much more violent than the white indentured servitude that existed in the American colonies, although that was not devoid of violence either. And the other thing is the way that they accumulate years. So first of all, many people were either just outright kidnapped, right? And this is where shares similarities with slavery in the sense that British merchants would kidnap people in southern China, or they would, part of the trade with local merchants was they would just sell people, or they were tricked, thinking they were signing a contract to go work for somebody, but in reality didn't quite understand the terms of it because it was probably in a different language, or many people were illiterate themselves. The agents that brought in indentured laborers and servants to the Caribbean and the Pacific were purposely trying to trick them, and as a result of that would often look for the most desperate people, right? People who basically had nowhere else to turn, or they were just forcibly kidnapped in many cases. So one of the big differences is this is a Pacific phenomenon, not an Atlantic phenomenon. So slavery was, of course, this Atlantic triangle. Here it's happening in the Pacific, to kind of the west coast of the Americas and to the Caribbean. Now, this is why it starts in the British Empire. And this is why, to this day, the population of places like Trinidad, the sort of demographic population, is what it is, or in Guyana. The other example of this is in India. So in China, over 8 million people emigrated to Southeast Asia, Thailand and Indonesia, and 2.8 million people went to the Americas, mostly to the Caribbean, and some of them ended up in Africa as well. Now, the next example of this was also in Indian indentured laborers, which was probably a little bit more violent than in the case of China. And part of the reason it was because the British controlled India, but they didn't control China, right? They don't have Hong Kong until the 1830s and the Opium Wars, right? So they have much more power and control in India and a large population. Many people were kidnapped. Others were people who fell into debt, who had no other choice but to sign labor contracts. And the way it worked in both the case of Indian and Chinese indentured laborers, and why this system was in many ways much worse than the system of indentured labor that existed for white Europeans in the early American colonies, was that you were technically paid to be an indentured laborer, something like 20 cents a day, but they would subtract that pay to things they provided. So if they provided you with clothes and food, that would be deducted from your daily wage. And these plantation owners always ensured that what you owed was more than what you were being paid. So a lot of people ended up in a form of debt peonage their entire life. And what debt peonage is basically that. You see it in other industries as well. In the sailing industry in the 19th century and early 20th century, it worked like this. But essentially, you end up owing money to the employer, the person who owns the contract of indenture, and the only way that you can pay off that money is to keep working for them. So many indentured servants that came from China and India who maybe freely thought they were signing up for a term of 5, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, in actuality ended up serving their entire lives because of that system of debt peonage that emerged, right? The fact that they were basically meant to pay for everything that they were given, clothing, food, all of that, and they weren't actually paying them enough money to pay for it. It kept them in this system of bondage their entire life. It's not the same thing as slavery. If they had children, the child wouldn't be born into it, but would be left very vulnerable to that system. And of course, for the people who were just forcibly kidnapped, it was much easier to keep them in that system itself. You see this in other parts of the world as well. The focus is on the British Empire, but even in the United States, for those of you that had studied Canadian history, if we look at the railroads, right? The Canadian Railroad and the American Pacific Railroad was built with essentially Chinese indentured labor, right? Part of it was because there was a labor scarcity in the American and Canadian West, right? There's really nobody there. So it was actually more efficient and cheaper to bring people across the largest ocean in the world, the Pacific, to work in the railroad in California or British Columbia than it was to bring settlers, white settlers, from the eastern United States and eastern Canada to the Pacific. Now, it was the same thing. They were brought as indentured laborers. And the horrible reality of that is once white settlers moved into that territory, right, that's when you got the anti-Chinese movement in British Columbia and California before it. And as a result of that, there were efforts in both Canada and the United States to ban what they called foreign contract labor, right? To stop the importation of foreign contract workers, because white workers were afraid of the same thing white workers are afraid of in the United States today, which is quote unquote foreigners taking their jobs. But the unfortunate tragedy of this was that even though they wanted to ban a system of unfree labor, they did not actually feel solidarity with their Chinese counterparts, right? Historian May Nye puts it this way. She said, white Americans were opposed to Chinese slavery or indenture, but could not support Chinese freedom. And that really sums it up. That instead, what it led to was a very violent, xenophobic, anti-Chinese movement in both California and British Columbia as a result of that. Obviously, it's a little bit different in the Caribbean because the white population is much smaller, so you didn't have that type of xenophobic, anti-Chinese or anti-Indian movement arise in the Caribbean, although there was tension between people who were former slaves and the newly arrived indentured servants. And part of that tension was a lot of what this problem solved was not just bringing in more laborers, but it served as a disciplinary function for former slaves, saying, look, if you don't work the way we want you to work, we'll replace you with these people, right? Which is why, to this day, there is still tension between some of these groups in this part of the world, right? So this is just how you want to think of it. If we go to our next slide here, it just kind of sums up everything that I've been talking about, right? It's indentured labor from South Asia, from southern China. It's Pacific rather than an Atlantic phenomenon. It follows slave emancipation, and it's the continuing reliance of unfree labor in agriculture, in extractive industries, and infrastructure. You also get this in South Africa as well. Indian indentured laborers especially end up in East Africa, in South Africa, today South Africa, which is why there's a large Indian population in places like Zimbabwe and Tanzania, but also and especially South Africa at this point. And that is partly why, as I said, when we looked at the xenophobic anti-Chinese movement in British Columbia and the United States, you get a very similar movement in South Africa, only it's a lot more successful when you get eventually the rise of the apartheid state, when the sort of minority of Afrikaners or Dutch white settlers essentially create this system of apartheid that has a racial hierarchy in which they place themselves at the top and they place indigenous Africans at the bottom and Indians in the middle. It's just something to consider. So this is a lot of what we're talking about when we look at unfree labor and the persistence of unfree labor. In the British context, this was to solve a problem, and the problem was the end of slavery and what to do about that labor problem. So I'm going to leave it at that today, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow. And if you have any questions about the book review assignment, feel free to contact me or one of the TAs. Okay.